I have destroyed everything. For what? A fleeting thrill? A hunger that could never be satisfied? I was weak. I let loneliness twist my mind. Let desire strip me of reason. I betrayed my vows, my home, my own self-respect. I told myself it was love. But love doesn't leave you hollow, suffocating beneath the weight of your own shame. Davis is gone. My husband is oblivious. And I am left alone with my wreckage. I am nothing but a woman who let her heart outrun her morals. Who traded stability for disaster. And now, I have to live with it. Forever. The house felt like a hollow shell, filled only with the monotonous hum of the television and the slow, rhythmic clink of ice swirling in my husband's glass. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of stale whiskey and unspoken words. Every night was the same, him, lost in the haze of his own oblivion, and me, moving through the motions of a life that had long since dulled. The silence was deafening, pressing against my skin like a weight I couldn't shake. I scrubbed the dishes harder than necessary, as if the pressure of my hands against porcelain could erase the aching void inside me. Then, I heard it, a shift in the air, the soft sound of footsteps. My pulse quickened before I could stop it. Davis, his presence, sharp and undeniable, cut through the suffocating quiet. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me. His gaze lingered, not casual, not fleeting. It held something deeper, something that made the space between us suddenly feel too small. Long night? He asked. His voice smooth, but careful. I forced a smile, pretending the shiver down my spine wasn't real. Same as always, I lied, but nothing felt the same anymore. The moment was fleeting, almost insignificant, just the accidental brush of skin against skin. Yet, in that single second, everything changed. I was reaching for a glass, turning to place it on the counter when Davis moved at the same time. Our fingers touched, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. My breath caught, my pulse stuttered, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something. His hand lingered a second too long before he pulled back, his eyes locking onto mine, searching, questioning. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved. The air between us thickened, charged with something unsaid, something we both felt but refused to acknowledge. The moment stretched unbearably, a silent war between reason and temptation. I should have laughed it off, made some excuse, turned away, but I didn't. I stood there, rooted in place, as if drawn by an invisible thread, unable, or unwilling, to break free. His expression darkened, not in anger, but in something more dangerous, something unspoken. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. It was nothing, I told myself, an accident, a meaningless touch, and yet, my skin still burned where his had been. Davis exhaled, a slow, measured breath, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. He felt it too. The realization sent a thrill down my spine, followed immediately by a wave of panic. This was wrong. Whatever this was, whatever was shifting between us, it wasn't supposed to happen. But it already had. I turned abruptly, retreating to the sink, gripping its edges as if I could steady myself. My reflection in the window above the basin showed wide eyes, flushed cheeks, a woman who no longer recognized herself. Behind me, Davis was still there, silent, unmoving. I could feel the weight of his stare against my back, pressing, waiting. Say something, I begged myself. Make it normal again. But no words came. A voice shattered the silence. My husband's, slurred and lazy from the living room. Clara, bring me another drink. Reality crashed back in, harsh and unforgiving. The spell broke. Davis exhaled sharply, stepping back, shoving his hands into his pockets. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to move, to breathe, to remember what was real and what was dangerous. I grabbed the whiskey bottle with trembling fingers, willing myself not to look at Davis as I passed him. But as I set the drink beside my oblivious husband, I knew the truth. Something had changed. It was barely a whisper now, a spark flickering in the darkness. But sparks, left unchecked, could burn entire houses down. Sleep became a distant memory. Nights stretched long, restless, my mind trapped in an endless loop of stolen glances and fleeting touches that had lasted only seconds but had burned into my skin like fire. Every breath I took felt heavier, every movement carefully measured, as if the ground beneath me had become treacherous, capable of giving way at any moment. I told myself it was nothing, a mistake, an accident, a brief lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew better. It was the start of something. Something dangerous. And Davis knew it too. We danced around each other, pretending nothing had changed, pretending the air wasn't charged with something too volatile to name. But the tension crackled between us, growing thicker with each passing night. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his gaze lingering too long, too heavy, and when I looked back, neither of us turned away fast enough. It was in the way his body tensed whenever we were in the same room, in the way my pulse quickened when I felt him nearby. A silent battle raged within us, restraint against the inevitable pull of temptation. One evening, as I cleared the table, I felt him behind me before I even turned. Close, too close, my breath hitched, heart hammering against my ribs. I should have moved away. I should have done anything but stand there, frozen in the unbearable heat of his presence. But I didn't. His voice, low and quiet, reached me before anything else. You don't have to do everything alone. I closed my eyes. It was such a simple sentence, yet it unraveled something inside me. For years, I had carried the weight of this household, the loneliness of an absent husband, the quiet ache of being invisible. No one had ever acknowledged it. No one had ever seen me. Until now. Until him. I turned slowly, hesitantly, meeting his gaze. The world outside the kitchen faded, my husband's distant voice from the television becoming nothing more than background noise. Davis's eyes searched mine, dark, questioning, waiting. Neither of us moved, but the space between us was no longer empty, it was filled with all the words we couldn't say. All the things we refused to admit. A test. That's what this was. A slow, intoxicating game of restraint. A push and pull of denial and inevitability. The rational part of me screamed to step back, to shut this down before it went too far. But another part, the part that had been starved for attention, for connection, for something real, wanted to stay, to lean in, to see what would happen if I let go. Then, a sound, my husband shifting on the couch, muttering something incoherent, sent a jolt through me. I pulled away as if burned, forcing a breath into my lungs. Davis clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply, the moment slipping through our fingers like sand. But we both knew, this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The promise to stop had been made in silence, but it was already broken before it had even formed. Every night, I told myself this would end, that whatever had begun between Davis and me would fade into nothing. But it didn't. It grew, it festered, it burned, like a fire smoldering beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest breath of air to set it ablaze again. And the worst part? I wanted the fire. Each day, we carried the weight of our secret in the way we moved around the house, careful, deliberate, pretending not to notice each other even as we felt the pull tighten around us. It was unbearable, like standing on the edge of something dangerous, knowing one wrong step would send us plummeting but being unable to step back. I knew it in the way my breath hitched whenever he entered a room, the way my skin tingled with awareness whenever he was near, the way my heart pounded, traitorous and desperate, when I heard his voice, low and steady, speaking words that no longer felt innocent. And he knew it too. It was there in his hesitation before he left a room, as if waiting for me to stop him, in the way he leaned just a little too close when reaching past me for something. His breath ghosting against my skin, my pulse thrumming in response, in the way his fingers lingered when they shouldn't, how his eyes darkened when they met mine in moments stolen between reality and the weight of consequence. This was no longer something we could control. This was hunger, and hunger demanded to be fed. One night, after my husband had passed out drunk, the silence of the house felt different. It was charged, humming with a presence neither of us could ignore. I was in the kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter, fighting a war one was losing. I had felt him standing there for minutes before either of us spoke. "You've been avoiding me," Davis said, his voice quiet but sure. I turned, finally meeting his gaze. It was a mistake, because the fire was there, reflected back at me, growing, demanding. "We should," I whispered, even as I stepped toward him instead of away. His jaw tensed, his hands curled at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself. But there was no point. We had already lost this battle. "I don't think I can," he admitted, voice tight, raw. The words undid me, because I couldn't either. And in the space between my next breath and my next heartbeat, I knew, this wouldn't stop. This couldn't stop. The fire had already taken hold. And there was no putting it out now. Every glance was a risk. Every accidental touch, a battle lost. The space between us had become a war zone. A battlefield where restraint and surrender clashed in an unrelenting cycle of longing and self-denial. We weren't just resisting each other. We were resisting the inevitable. It started in the small moments. The ones that shouldn't have mattered but did. A brush of his arm against mine as we passed in the hallway. The flicker of hesitation when we reached for something at the same time. The unspoken words that hovered on our lips. Trapped beneath the weight of knowing we were dangerously close to crossing a line we could never return from. It was a game neither of us wanted to play. And yet, neither of us could walk away from it. I became hyper-aware of his presence. My senses sharpening whenever he was near. I could hear the shift in his breathing when I entered a room. Feel the weight of his gaze before I even turned to look. I told myself it was in my head. That I was imagining the tension growing between us. But the truth was undeniable, it was real. And it was consuming us. One evening, while my husband was passed out in the living room, I found myself in the kitchen again. Standing at the sink, hands gripping the counter as if it could ground me. I felt him before I saw him. The air around me changed. Thickened. Pulsed. I turned slowly, finding him leaning against the doorway. His eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. Neither of us spoke. We had spoken enough through stolen glances and quickened breaths. His gaze traveled over me. Slow and deliberate. Like he was committing every detail to memory. Like he was silently asking, how much longer can we pretend? I should have walked away. I should have shattered the silence. Broken whatever spell had wrapped itself around us. Instead, I stayed, held in place by an invisible force neither of us could name but both of us could feel. Then he moved, just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. Enough to set my pulse racing. Enough to steal the air from my lungs. My fingers tightened against the counter. My body swayed forward before I could stop it. And then, a noise. A sharp breath. A shift on the couch in the next room. A reminder that just beyond the kitchen walls, my husband lay asleep, unaware of the fire raging between his wife and his son. A fire that was spreading, growing, threatening to consume everything in its path. Davis exhaled sharply, jaw tight, fists clenched. He stepped back. A retreat. A declaration of war. This wasn't over. It never would be. Every moment felt like walking a tightrope. The ground beneath me unstable. The air heavy with the weight of an impending fall. The guilt had settled deep into my bones. But it wasn't enough to stop me. Not yet. Not when the pull toward Davis was still stronger than my better judgment. But now, a new force had entered the game, fear. It crept in at the edges. Coiling around my throat. Squeezing my chest whenever I heard my husband stir in the next room. Every sound in the house became a threat. Every movement, a risk. The fear of being caught became another kind of thrill. Twisted and dangerous. Making every interaction with Davis feel like playing with fire. I began to anticipate disaster in the smallest things. My husband shifting on the couch. Muttering in his drunken sleep. The flickering of the kitchen light. Casting shadows that made my heart leap in paranoia. The way Davis would tense at the sound of his father's voice. His body coiled tight like he was ready to fight or flee. We were no longer just hiding from the truth, we were hiding from the possibility of being exposed. One evening, as I stood by the sink pretending to wash a dish I had already cleaned twice, I felt Davis behind me. His presence was a current, an invisible force that made my skin prickle. I didn't turn, didn't move, but I felt the whisper of his breath just close enough to send a shiver down my spine. It was reckless, too reckless. And then, a sound. A creak from the living room. A shifting weight on the couch. A muffled groan. I sucked in a sharp breath. My heart slamming against my ribs. Davis froze behind me, his posture rigid. For a brief, terrifying moment, I imagined my husband rising, stumbling into the kitchen, catching us like two thieves in the night. The thought made my stomach churn. What would he see? What would he do? But the moment passed. The house remained still. My husband continued to sleep. Oblivious as always, lost in the haze of alcohol and indifference. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Davis stepped back, his eyes flickering toward the living room. Then back to me. A silent warning. A silent acknowledgement. We had gone too far. The walls were closing in. I wanted to believe that was the wake-up call we needed. That fear would be enough to stop us. But even as my hands trembled and my chest ached with the weight of what we had nearly done, I knew the truth. We were afraid of getting caught. but not afraid enough to stop. It had been unraveling for days, slow, steady, inevitable. The tension had turned suffocating. The weight of what we had done pressing harder against my chest with every passing moment. Davis had grown distant, his silence heavier than any of the words we hadn't dared to say. Something had shifted. He no longer lingered in the kitchen after dark. No longer let his fingers graze mine in passing. But it wasn't restraint that kept him away, it was something darker. Something I couldn't name but felt deep in my bones. Then, one night, I found him in the living room, standing over his father. My breath caught, fear slicing through me like a blade. My husband was sprawled out, deep in another whiskey-induced slumber, oblivious to the storm brewing in his own home. But Davis wasn't oblivious. He stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, his entire body thrumming with an energy that sent ice through my veins. Something was boiling beneath his skin. Something violent, something dangerous. Davis? My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't turn, didn't even flinch. He was staring at his father with an intensity that terrified me. A kind of fury I had never seen in him before. The air crackled with something unspoken, something that made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. Davis, what are you doing? Finally, he looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes shook me to my core. Pain, betrayal, something raw and bleeding, something that had been festering long before this moment. I had always known Davis harbored resentment toward his father, his absence, his neglect, the way he had let everything in this house decay, including me. But this was different. This wasn't just anger. This was realization. This was clarity. This was the moment he understood just how broken everything truly was. I can't do this anymore, he whispered. The words hit harder than I expected. My chest tightened. Davis, I'm leaving. His voice was firm, final, unforgiving. Panic surged through me. No, this couldn't be how it ended. Not like this. Not with him walking away, taking whatever had existed between us and leaving me behind in the wreckage. I shook my head, stepping closer. You don't have to go, I pleaded. His eyes softened, but the decision had already been made. Yes, I do. The breath left my lungs. This was the end, and it was crushing me. Davis took one last glance at his father, his lips pressing into a tight line. And then he turned away. Just like that, as if we had never happened. As if the fire between us had burned itself out. But I knew better. This wasn't a flame extinguished. This was a fire abandoned, left smoldering, waiting for someone to breathe it back to life. The house felt different without him. Quieter, colder, emptier in a way I hadn't expected. I had always known Davis wasn't meant to stay. That whatever had happened between us had been fleeting. Impossible. And yet, the weight of his absence pressed against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. He was gone, and now, there was only silence. The morning he left, I had watched from the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around myself as he loaded his bags into his car. He moved with quiet efficiency, never once hesitating, never once looking back, not even when I wanted him to. My husband, still lost in his hangover, barely noticed. Kids need their space, he muttered, rubbing his temple before going back to his routine of existing but never really being present. Davis, however, had been present, too present, and now, he was gone. I had thought it would be easier this way. That once he was out of sight, it would be easier to forget, to move on, to pretend. But the truth was, his presence lingered like a ghost in the house. In the echoes of our whispered conversations, in the spaces where he used to stand. My fingers would hover over my phone, debating whether to send a message, a simple question, anything to break the silence. But I never did. Instead, I let the emptiness consume me. The days blurred together. My husband remained oblivious, lost in his own world, unaware of the cracks that had splintered beneath his roof. I went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, existing, but everything felt hollow. Because no matter how much I tried to deny it, I missed him. And worse, I knew he missed me too. The first message came late at night. A simple, "Are you okay?" that made my heart leap into my throat. I stared at it for too long, fingers trembling over the screen, before I finally responded, "I'm fine." A lie. But what else could I say? That every room in this house felt wrong without him? That my hands still ached from the way they had once held him? That even now, I was still thinking of the night we had whispered promises we could never keep? His reply was brief. "Good." And that was it. The polite distance. The unspoken rule that we wouldn't talk about what happened. That we would pretend we had not been on the edge of something dangerous. Something that had nearly ruined us both. And yet, we were still here, still tethered by the choices we had made. I had thought saying goodbye would be the hardest part. But it wasn't. The hardest part was knowing this wasn't over. Because some things, no matter how forbidden, no matter how wrong, never truly end. Time had passed. Enough time that I should have forgotten. Enough time that the ache in my chest should have dulled. That the phantom traces of his touch should have faded from my skin. But time is a cruel liar. Whispering promises of healing while secretly stitching the wounds deeper. Because I hadn't forgotten, and I never would, I could still feel him in the house. In the spaces where we had once stood too close. In the silence where his voice should have been. The weight of his absence had settled over me, not as relief, but as something heavier, something suffocating. He had left, but the fire he had started still burned. In the quiet hours of the night, I felt it the most, that relentless, consuming hunger that had not been satisfied, only starved. And then, the message came. I saw his name on my screen and the world shifted. A single moment, a breath stolen straight from my lungs. My hands trembled as I read it. Simple, casual, I shouldn't be texting you. A confession wrapped in restraint. A whisper of something unfinished. I stared at it, at the blinking cursor waiting for my response. My heart slamming against my ribs. The logical part of me screamed to ignore it. To delete it. To bury what we had already buried once before. But desire does not die, it lingers. Restless, waiting for the smallest invitation to reignite. But you did. I sent the message before I could stop myself. The words hanging between us like an open door. And there it was, the unraveling. Beginning all over again. A second paw. I can't stop thinking about you. A wildfire. Ready to S. My breath came too fast. My body reacting before my mind could catch up. The past came rushing back. Filling the gaps between my ribs. Pressing against my skin like something I had been trying to outrun. This was not over. It had never been over. And as I lay there, staring at the screen, my hands gripping the sheets like an anchor, I knew one truth, undeniable and terrifying. Some ghosts never fade, some fires never burn out. And this? This was only the beginning. In today's world, emotions can be unpredictable, intoxicating, and sometimes dangerous. The story serves as a reminder that temptation often appears in the quiet spaces of loneliness. And boundaries exist for a reason. The choices we make in moments of weakness can have lasting consequences. If you find yourself drawn towards something forbidden, ask yourself, is this worth the risk? Seek clarity before acting on emotion. Build meaningful connections where they belong. And don't allow fleeting passion to destroy what truly matters. True fulfillment comes not from secrecy, but from honesty, self-awareness, and choosing the right kind of love.